Well, good afternoon. We're, as you know, at the Milken Institute events, we like to go for a minimum of 12 hours a day. We might top our record today. So we're honored today to have with us An0drew Witty, the leader of GSK, and a company like many that has changed the world for all of us with their advancements. So let's start with why did you choose Singapore as an Asian hub?
Well, first of all, Mike, thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to have the opportunity to be here. We've been in Singapore actually as a company since just after World War I, and is one of the great stories of entrepreneurialism in the 1920s. In fact, one of my predecessors got assigned here to Singapore, and he basically spent 3 months of the year here, then got on a boat, went to Hong Kong for 3 months, then got on a boat and went to Kuala Lumpur for 3 months, and that was basically his life for the first 10 years as they started to create the business out here. Been here a long time. We have a long history, good relationship with the Singaporean government, and then over the last 30 years, this has really become the epicenter for our sophisticated chemical manufacturing. So many of you may know about 50% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients come out of Singapore, and there's no exception for GSK. We have 3 major factories here in Singapore manufacturing many of our biggest selling medicines, the bulk formulations, and also one of the world's most modern vaccine facilities here. So a very strong relationship around manufacture. That's because of the fantastic educational standard here and the very strong process technology capabilities. And then around that, over the last 20 years, including when I was based here running the Asian region, we've increasingly established, first of all, our regional headquarters for close in Asia, and we're just in the final stages of building one of our 3 global headquarters. So we have a headquarters in North America, we have one in Europe, and we will shortly have one here, which will essentially operate the entire time zone to more or less this side of Istanbul will be run out of Singapore. So increasingly what we've aimed to do is build Singapore from those foundational relationships into essentially a split brain of the corporation. So the goal is that any decision that can be taken in the time zone should be taken in the time zone and not referred back to London. And that's exactly the stage we're now at, and we'll be opening those facilities in March next year.
You know, it's interesting, Sir An0drew, when I interact with young individuals who've chosen finance as a career, I often ask them, how many of you went into finance to change the world? Unfortunately, there's very few hands that ever go up when I ask that question. You know, I chose to go into finance as an opportunity to change the world, redirect capital flows. Let's talk about why you went into an industry which has really changed the world in so many ways for so many individuals. And also today, have you seen any change in the people you recruit and the human capital that works for the company around the world?
Yeah, no question at all. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that the day I joined from university, I had some great vision of how I might change the world. I had a very strong sense that this industry made a real impact on individual lives. It's only as you get the chance to grow into a company and you get to see the influence of the industry and the track record of the industry in terms of its innovation that you start to see the overall impact. If we'd been born 100 years ago, so if we'd been born in 1916, then our average life expectancy, even as a British citizen, would have been 40 years. To now it's over 80. And essentially the things which have driven that are clean water, vaccine, pharmaceutical, and increased calorie count. That's essentially the 4 things which have driven it. 2 of those 4 things come from my industry. If you look at the acceleration of life expectancy worldwide, that benefit has simply been replicated on an accelerating pace into the emerging markets, and those countries are living through those benefits as we speak. So it's inescapable to feel that, and you feel it every single day. When I was a sales representative, I'll never forget going into a doctor's office in England, and to cut a very long story short, it was an absolutely packed doctor's office full of patients, and as a representative, you're pretty much the bottom of the food chain, so you have to wait for all the patients, quite rightly, to go in before you get a chance to see a doctor. And I was sat there waiting patiently, and the doctor came out. I'd never met this guy before. He was a young doctor, sometimes aren't the most friendly to sales representatives. And he came out and he said, "Where's the guy from Glaxo?" And I thought, oh God, something terrible's happened. I'm going to get my head blown off in front of all of these patients. And I stood up, and he walked over to me in the middle of the waiting room, put his hand on my shoulder. I was 23 years old. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "You need to know your company saves people's lives." Turned around and walked off. At which point the patients all said, "Who do you work for?" Because they all wanted to know which drugs we were selling. And actually at that very early stage, that's exactly the feeling you get in this business, because while there are lots of controversies around this industry, it fundamentally has a huge impact at the individual level. And then what I've learned over the last 10 or 15 years, as I've had much more senior positions, is, of course, then you have the choice to decide how you deploy the capabilities of your organization on a much more population basis. And that's why over the last few years we've been so committed to opening up our emerging markets business, why we've been very aggressive in terms of tiered pricing, liberalizing our attitude towards intellectual property, our commitments across the board in Africa, not just to innovate, but to ensure that innovation is delivered with access to patients. Because ultimately, if an innovation takes place that nobody can afford or nobody can access, then it's not an innovation. It's just a piece of sexy technology, but it's not truly an innovation. And that's really the continuous challenge that this industry has, because it needs to generate economic returns for its shareholders to allow it to carry on, but it has to keep on trying to find evolutions of its business model to make sure that the broader population, the 6 billion people who do not live in America and Northern Europe, get access. Otherwise, ultimately, the business model on which we've been built cannot survive. And so the challenge is not just how you make a difference to that one individual doctor who's talking about that one patient. It's how you leverage everything to give populations the opportunity in a much more accelerated way.
So I think, we've talked at this conference about, Sir An0drew, some of the points you've just made. The unbelievable accomplishment we've had in extending life, and the movement just in a short period of time of 1 century, which has dramatically increased life expectancy. This part of the world, Southeast Asia, and South Asia has been a major beneficiary, with an 80% increase in life expectancy in 2 generations. You briefly mentioned Africa. So the youngest part of the world, median age under 20, doubling life expectancy in 1 generation. Give us a little feeling for the challenges and opportunities that you see in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and some of the things maybe we could do to make your work more effective there.
No, I'd love to. I mean, first of all, for those of you who may or may not know my background, my first general manager job was in sub-Saharan Africa. So I, as a 27-year-old, was shipped off to Africa to learn which way was up, and it's a great place to have that experience. So having spent several years working in Africa, it very firmly informs the way I've thought about our overall business and corporate strategy. So for me, Africa is clearly a massive source of, obviously, population growth, but over time we're seeing this continued improvement in governance standards, we're seeing improvement in overall economic activity, and I think you'd be a fool to bet against Africa being a material contributor to global prosperity over the next 2 or 3 generations. Having said all of that, it's also true to say that the constituencies of the developed world care about what happens in Africa, and particularly in today's social media connected world. You made a comment earlier, Mike, about the kind of people who work for GSK. I can tell you the number 1 retention trigger for staying at GSK for everybody in the company, on average, is what we do in Africa. So the number 1 reason a scientist works for us in London is because of what they see us do for people in Africa. And that's something which is only getting stronger as the next generations come through with an ever greater worldview and a sense of connectedness on a much more global basis. That's important. In terms of what we've done in Africa, we're a very substantial company. I think we probably are the biggest pharmaceutical company in Africa, certainly one of the top 2, by far the biggest volume supplier in Africa. And we've tried to drive a number of very different strategies. So, for example, for the poorest 60 countries in the world, most of whom are in Africa, and remember that 75% of the world's healthcare burden is in Africa, and Africa only spends 2% of the world healthcare budget, so you have this massive asymmetry of burden over budget. Within that environment, we've expanded just over the last 3 years by 25% the number of people we have in Africa. I can tell you half of our leadership cadre, half of our general managers in Africa are women. We have an enormous empowerment program to make sure that our African businesses are led and run by African folks who really understand what's going on and have a passion for their country. That's important. We've been very flexible around intellectual property. So for the poorest countries in the world, we essentially waive our rights to intellectual property. Not because we don't think IP is important. It's obviously the key underpinning of our business model. But when a country has no money, it's a completely irrelevant conversation to be having. We need to be recognizing that just like price, intellectual property ought to be graduated in its application, with the richest countries having the highest degree of application, the poorest the lowest. The same on price. If you look at the way in which we've been able to transform the number of people treated with HIV, just 5 years ago, the Millennium Goals set targets that 15 million people in the world should be treated with HIV medicines by now. Actually, it's the one and only Millennium Goal which was beaten, because actually 17 million people have been treated with HIV meds, many of them from GSK and our partners. One of the things which I would really believe in, and I think even if you're not in the healthcare space, but if you have an operation in Africa, I'd like to appeal to you to think about. When we're in a country as a corporation, we're a guest of that country. And we benefit from being there. We can obviously argue we deliver great value through employment and the like, but we clearly benefit from being a citizen of these countries. And we benefit from ever-increasing capacity of these countries. That led GSK 5 years ago to make a decision that in sub-Saharan Africa, and in fact in the 60 poorest countries in the world, we would donate 20% of any profits that we make as a company in those territories to healthcare infrastructure builds inside those countries. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit that 20% of our profits in these countries, not very much. Nobody makes huge amounts of money in these countries because by definition they're not very well developed, but we make something. And by donating 20%, in our case, back through an NGO network, just in the last 4 years, we've trained 40,000 frontline healthcare workers who are now providing healthcare support to 11 million people in Africa. By 2020, we will have trained 150,000 healthcare workers who will be giving healthcare support to 150 million people. Now, if, like me, you believe that economic development has something to do with food supply, sanitation, education, healthcare, then I think it's incumbent not just on government, but on the corporations who are enjoying the benefits of being economically active in the country to build future infrastructure. And I'd really encourage folks who've got businesses in the poorest countries in the world to think about, just for a second, would it really move the needle of your global corporate P&L to make a more permanent contribution? Not a CSR when you feel like it contribution or where somebody asks you, but a long-term sustainable contribution. My personal view is that that will accelerate the economic development which will allow the population growth to become much more rapidly balanced in terms of its economic contribution to the world. So that would be my ask. Our personal experience is it has been extraordinarily successful.
So let's step back, and what you've just heard is one of the most responsible corporations in the world in activity. And it's hard to compare quite often, and it's sad to see how the media has interacted, in particularly in the West, and particularly the United States, to the industry that's most accountable for the growth, not only of the world's economy, but the extension of life and the quality of life. Let's just take a look at AIDS for a moment here, if we can think about it. It was back in 1987 that Oprah Winfrey, leading talk show host in the United States, went on television and told the American people, research studies now project that 1 in 5, listen to me, hard to believe, 1 in 5 heterosexuals would be dead from AIDS at the end of the next 3 years. You know, you're scared to leave the house when you see that. That's by 1990, 1 in 5. Then, often I refer to, he's a close friend, the most beloved athlete, told us a couple years later, he went on television and that he had AIDS. I don't know if that video will run or not, but Magic Johnson went on television and told us that he's going to have to retire from the NBA. And thanks to GSK and others, what has occurred? Well, Magic Johnson was alive and well with us at the Summit for Public Health when we tried to drive and change the world for medical research.
The HIV virus that I have attained, I will have to retire from the labor today.
The day that I heard about Magic, it just sort of changed my love for basketball. It shook me up. You know, you get that feeling, about the same type of feeling I had when my father died.
Called me, you can almost hear both of us with some tears in our eyes. And I'm choked up because he did call me. When something happens, to you, and then you find out who really your friends are and people who really care about you.
So 2012, Magic's there, that big smile in Washington, D.C., thanks to GSK and others. He's there with Tony Fauci, who's really led the world in goal of eliminating AIDS as a cause of death, and 2/3 of everyone living a normal life today. And for a woman, you've gone from a 90% to a 2% chance with proper treatment of passing AIDS on to your children. And Sir An0drew, I'd just like to thank you for your contribution to that effort personally.
I wonder if I could tell you a story about that, if that's... in 1989, I was appointed to co-lead the project team for a HIV drug, and at that time we only had one drug, AZT, which also came from a part of GlaxoSmithKline. But 3TC was the drug that I was assigned to, called lamivudine, or Epivir. And it's a very interesting example of drug discovery, and I'll just share it with you in the context of this whole conversation. We put this drug into development, and at the time, nobody really believed that we would be able to convert HIV to a chronic disease. And most of the healthcare resources were being directed to plan for end-of-life treatment, so hospice, hospitals, where folks would inevitably have to be managed in the last few weeks of life. It was a very negative, very depressing environment. We put this drug into development, and we, like everybody else, we put the drug in as a monotherapy treatment. And the first data came back, and it showed that the drug generated a resistant mutant in the virus quite quickly. And actually, the effect of the drug looked very good for the first period, but then quite quickly waned. And hard to describe how depressing it is when that happens in these sorts of situations. And the company was rationally right on the edge of terminating the development of that drug. And just before the decision was taken to terminate the development of that drug, a second trial reported where we'd also experimented in patients with the new drug, but also with AZT, which nobody had ever tried anything like that before. And it turned out, long story short and a little bit simplified, that the mutation that the new drug was generating, combined with the mutation that AZT generated, disabled the virus. A completely unpredictable event. And as a consequence, AZT and 3TC became the most widely prescribed drug. Combivir is essentially the most commonly used product over the period of the 90s and really broke the back of HIV management. There are many other drugs, particularly from Gilead, over the subsequent 10 years, which have added enormously. I think Gilead deserve enormous credit for the progress that they've also made. And GSK more recently has just launched a whole new wave of innovation, which is in itself taken us on one step further. I just wanted to share that story with you because it's a very emotional thing to be involved in HIV at the very beginning, and it's extraordinarily formative of how you think about the role of drug companies, if you're in one. Secondly, it was always a great tragedy that HIV and the actions of some companies, including my own at different times, we sometimes are very good at shooting ourselves in the foot to create reasons to be criticised, and it can be annoying, to say the least. But it also is a really good example of the uncertainty of drug discovery, right? Imagine if we'd been super rational, if we'd done what everybody said we should have done, that drug would never have surfaced. And if 3TC hadn't have surfaced, the whole treatment of HIV would have been delayed another 5 years. And it just gives you a sense of the risk and the uncertainty, the unpredictability of drug development, which I think to a very large part, people who are not inside the medical drug research community, I think people just don't understand that. They don't understand the uncertainty, the risk, and just the need to constantly be patient and exploring these opportunities, because it's the unexpected that makes the great breakthrough.
So, Sir An0drew, and just to follow up, we'll give you two examples. Polio. They were estimating that polio was going to cost just the United States $100 billion a year in early 1950s. And similar to AIDS, the country was preparing to build hotels to hold polio patients throughout the United States, literally at that time. And parents were scared, and there's an example of what these iron lung hotels look like, and they were planning to be built. And then a few years later, before the building of all these hotels, Jonas Salk came to bear. And for today, for almost all the people on the planet, and if we vaccinated everyone, polio would be in the history books. And you might not know this, but it was declared effective April 12, 1955. But a lot of people were scared to take the vaccine because they thought it would give you polio. And the United States recruited maybe the most notable person in the country, Elvis Presley, who went on television and got his polio vaccination, which turned the tide. And so I would tell you the same story on immunology, a technology today that might change the world for all of us. They were about to shut down the program at the University of California, Berkeley, and a small contribution, $50,000 to $75,000 from my wife and myself to our alma mater, kept it alive, and Jim Allison today and Urivoy. And what's occurred is we've opened up a whole different line of treatment, this simple idea that we can energize your own immune system, which can deal with your cancer. So, Sir An0drew, when I think about the sad fact that you're stepping down next year, and as such a great spokesman for the industry and the world, what's your outlook for the industry today? And what are the biggest challenges and opportunities? And what are the skills do you believe required to be a CEO of an international pharmaceutical industry?
Wow, that's a big question. Just before I answer that, I just wonder, anybody like to guess how much a dose of GSK polio vaccine costs? We supply about 400 million doses a year. Anybody like to hazard a guess? Somebody. How much?
Cents.
It's 14 cents. That's what it costs to vaccinate a child against polio. And actually, as of today, there are less than 20 people on the planet with polio, and they all live on the Afghan-Pakistan border, which tells you that healthcare is incredibly intertwined with politics. because that's really the last cluster, and that's really thanks to Bill Gates' effort to get it down to that level. I think to your bigger question, this industry is such a phenomenal, fantastic, and frustrating industry. It is full of the most incredibly passionate, clever, inspirational scientists and everybody who sits around them who are endlessly trying to do things. I always think, we get excited about the probe going to Jupiter. Quite rightly we should get excited. At least you can see Jupiter, right? When you look at what our scientists are trying, you can't see it. You can't see anything that you're dealing with. It's almost impossible to conceptualize what you're trying to do in drug development. It's an extraordinarily unusual type of mind. And don't make any mistake, this is still a business, a science field, which is as much an art as it is a science. You can have as much computer technology as you want, but you need the right brain to be able to spot the patterns of the opportunity. So you have all of that, and as Mike said, we're on the wave of a series of new innovations and technologies. Immunology, the leveraging of the human immune system is one. Not quickly, but sometime in the next 30, 50 years, we'll see some significant advances in brain science. It's going to take a long time. We're seeing vaccine technologies give us options far broader than anything we've seen before. You're going to see from companies like GSK vaccines against COPD. So we take diseases which we think about today as essentially unavoidable common diseases that we ought to be able to vaccinate people against. You'll see all of those sorts of things. And you'll see discoveries take place outside of normal chemistry, which is an area certainly at GSK we're very focused on. The problem is twofold, really. One, the very thing that drives all of that innovation, the public company, the crowdfunding that public companies create to drive this high-cost innovation, attract all of the downside criticism of being profit centers. And, I think most people who are sick don't like to think on the day they're sick that somebody somewhere is making money from that situation. So I think there's a very human level issue. There is a fundamental cost issue as we start to see healthcare costs creep up into the teens, high teens GDP rate in terms of society. And then there are the shooting in the foot moments that companies, including my own, have done over the years where we don't help ourselves. So the outlook at the primary level of demand is very positive for this industry. I think at the technology level, actually I think we're back at a position where we probably were at the end of the 1970s in terms of technological opportunity. I think the impact that this industry can make in terms of health is more fundamental now than it's ever been. I think we'll see disease transformation at a level that we've never seen. But we will get criticized like crazy for it because this is a high value, and it has to be a high value industry to support the risk that's taken in the approach. How does industry deal with that? We have to be a lot more empathetic as an industry to the people who are concerned. We have to be global in that empathy. We have to worry about how we deliver access to the whole 7 billion people on the planet, not just the folks in America and Northern Europe. We've got to figure out business models which allow us to do both, to be successful in the richer marketplaces and allow that stimulation of the next wave, but also to be successful in the poorer markets to make sure that access doesn't become a strategic Achilles heel for the industry. We're going to have to change the way we run our business model. At GSK, we've led the industry in transparency. We publish every single clinical trial we ever do, whether it succeeds or fails. All of that gets published. It took too long for industry to move in that direction. We've made it clear that we'll be flexible on intellectual property. We've made it clear that prices should be tiered. We've completely changed the way we pay our sales forces to avoid the conflict of interest risk, and we've changed the way we work with our customers, our doctors, in the way they help us promote our medicine. So at GSK, we no longer pay doctors to speak on our behalf. All of those things are elements of quite tough challenges to change your business model. And I think as a CEO, you better be prepared not just to be able to execute better than your predecessor in the current business model that you inherit, but you need to be brave enough to change your business model. And I think, as I look back over my nearly 10 years of being CEO, one of the things I'm proudest about is not just the financial performance or the delivery of the business, which, you have good years, you have bad years, but it's been the willingness of the company to look into itself and say, we're prepared to change the thing that everybody else or everybody before us believed to be impossible to change. You can change the way you do R&D, you can change the way you interact with your customers, and you can change fundamentally your proposition in terms of global offer around innovation and access. And I think CEOs, first and foremost, in today and the next 2 generations, will need that courage more than their ability to make the trains run on time, which I think has been the primary selection criteria historically.
So
the reason I say that is because I think we're moving into a fundamentally a shift in the world from a technology, but most importantly, generational. And I think that the folks who are coming up into society, into productive capacity today, I think we are at a point where we are going to see a difference in what they want to get from business, how they want to contribute to business, and they are going to be demanding of ambition around vision. And for me, that's what a CEO has got to do. Now, hopefully you can do both, but you absolutely are going to need to be able to do that.
Well, Sir An0drew, I want to thank you on behalf of the Milken Institute, our attendees today, for your contribution.
Thank you.
And it sounds from your description that the next Marvel superhero will be groomed to be the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and congratulations. You made it, the final panel. Throughout the summit, we discussed how global forces are helping to shape Asia. This panel hopes to take it forward in the context of recent developments in the political, economic, social, and financial space. When you take a look at some indicators, they suggest that growth is stalling. Larry Summers talks about a stagnation. And when you take a look at trade, it seems to be hitting a wall as well. Out of 15 container lines operating 9 months ago, 4 have either gone bust or about to. And the thing is, historically, when there is growth in the world, there's an even bigger growth in trade. The reverse is true. Fast forward. Some people say prospects are not looking so great. Others say they've never looked worse. And if you take a look at the McKinsey report that was released just today, it said that global growth will be half of what it is today. So you see the trend. So how many of you here are pretty optimistic about the prospects of Asia Pacific, considering that its future is intertwined with the rest of the world? Oh my God, not too many. But don't despair. Let's look into the crystal ball with our panelists today. Please join me in welcoming Raphael An0drew, Future Fund of the Australian Government, Jeffrey J., and I'm allowed to say that, right, Jeff? Deputy CIO and President of Public Markets GIC, Hiromichi Mizuno, Executive MD and CIO of Government Pension Investment Fund Japan, and Mark Taka, AIA Group CEO and President. Gentlemen, let's start with this question. Is the region at risk of a prolonged low growth?
Well, I think the simple answer is yes, but relative to the rest of the world, it's much more optimistic and the outlook is much better. So the Asian region, it's got a lot of things going for it. It's got a population growth. It's got people who are emerging to a middle class. It's got an increasingly educated population. But at the end of the day, it needs to import capital to fund that growth, whether it's in infrastructure, hard infrastructure, or whether it's in education. And so it is linked up with the rest of the world.
But Hiro, can there be optimism given that everything is depressed? Capital markets depressed, consumers are depressed. You take a look at rates, oh my God, negative rates. They're meant to help people spend, but they're saving instead. And take a look at Japan, 900 trillion yen in savings and deposits, which is more than half of the financial assets of the country.
Well, I think you picked the wrong panelist because I always find myself the most pessimistic person about the global economy. Maybe it suits my position of the CEO of the big fund, and we are all cash investors. So it's actually better to be a bit cautious. When talking about negative interest rate, that's actually very interesting, like experiment, I would say, and. Unfortunately, it didn't help at least Japanese consumer to feel more confident to spend more. So I think the some of the policy, monetary policy, if we try to encourage people to spend, actually work totally the other way around, and people are now feeling more uncertain about where this minus interest policy will take Japanese economy into the future. So they started saving even more. So that's one thing, but. Coming back to your earlier question of the, how I see the
low growth rate.
Low growth. Actually, I'm still really concerned about that. The people may still underestimate China economic slowdown risk. The IMF keep revising downwards their forecast for 2016 and 2017. Five times, and they are expecting to do the same next month probably. So it's going to be like 6 times in 18 months. So I think that's probably just basically what they are saying is they are very pessimistic, but they cannot do it just change it overnight. So they are just trying to gradually adjust the people's expectation.
But you say you're concerned about China. What exactly? I mean, Bridgewater talked about a China bust. Are you seeing the same thing?
I actually more concerned about China will take the Japanese, Japanese path of the going into long-term, slow growth. Because one thing is, this is the view I always have. Whatever the degree you are concerned about China, the problem is Chinese GDP is now as big as Japan, UK, Germany, 3 combined. And we have no confidence in what the exact number or what kind of the other growth actually happening at the moment. So it actually gives me enough reason to be really cautious and always think about tail end risk.
Jeff, cautious? A bit more upbeat?
I think I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think one way to understand it is that the model of development for Asia has by necessity changed. If you think about the 1970s and 1980s, the growth of Japan and then the new industrializing economies of Asia, which were all quite small at the time, depended on the growth of the US export market, the European export market, which were doing quite well. I think by the 1990s, that kind of reached a little bit of its limit. But the 2000s saw the development of China as the preeminent competitive producing country for exports into the US and Europe. And with it, it pulled the rest of Asia. And then it became more of a commodity as well as other pull-ins of imports from Asia into China. So those two models have changed. I think I completely agree with the view that the US and Europe will see growth slowing, in part because population growth is slowing down, in part because productivity growth is slowing down. And China's economic model is also changing. It's no longer the growth will not come from an export powerhouse with infrastructure build. It'll be different. Now the question is, can China and the other Asian economies pivot around into a growth model successfully? And much of that growth model will be around creating its own consumer demand, upgrading its own domestic consumption demand patterns. And I think there I have a little bit more optimism. Part of it is the following. In the old days, if you didn't have export growth, you basically didn't have the ability to grow savings fast enough in order to fund your own economy. If nothing else, we now have a global savings glut. If there are economies that can show that there is a model in which businesses can grow, in which they can generate demand internally, there will be capital to fund it. You just think about the businesses in China that has gotten funding in the last 5 years. So while the SOEs and the old economy haven't been growing, there's been more than enough money to fund the consumer-led, the technology-led type of industries. And That type of funding, that type of capital is certainly around, and it will be something that allows the other Asian economies to pivot around. Question, is there enough dynamism? Is there enough government support for these? And I think what we're seeing, certainly the last couple of years, is that governments do recognize that. You see that in India, the change of government from 2-3 years ago is a pivot to a more business-friendly, a more entrepreneurial government. We're seeing that in Indonesia, the Philippines, and so on. And China clearly is one that's struggling with making sure that environment is around. So I do think that there are good reasons to be optimistic.
I'll pick up on the pivot done by governments in a bit, but before that, I'd like to bring in Mark. You're pretty optimistic, and that has to do with the growing middle class. 2/3 of the middle class, I think by 2030, will be in Asia.
Yeah, I think a number of factors. I think in structurally and globally, clearly, the path of lower growth is likely going forward. But I would argue strongly against some of my fellow panelists here. When we look at demographics, when you look at urbanization, when you look at the emerging middle class, when you look at rising disposable incomes, when you look at high savings rates, when you look at low penetration of protection cover, all of those elements are fundamental to Asia, and they're structural, not cyclical. They're not going to change as a result of equity markets moving up and down, bond interest rates moving up and down. These will go through generationally, and I think that gives us and gives me enormous hope for the future and the opportunity. Clearly, issues in different countries, very difficult to generalize between the developed markets and the non-developed markets in terms of growth. But the opportunities, and I say, as one example, we've been growing at 25% per annum compound for 6 years. We're the second largest life insurance company in the world today. We see no stopping of that opportunity and that growth.
You're saying that pace of growth is sustainable where you're concerned?
I think the scale becomes more difficult at the size, but that the opportunity and the growth, I think, is more than possible to do, yes.
Mark talked about demographics. There are opportunities there, but there are also headwinds. I mean, when you take a look at the middle class, you also have to look at the rising aging population, not just in the developed world, but also developing world. It has spread. And therein lies the problem in itself. I mean, unemployment growth is falling. That is a problem, yes?
Well, I think we have to get a bit more sophisticated as investors than just look at this one measure of economic growth. I think at the end of the day, our job is to maximise the returns for the risk we're taking for our stakeholders, whomever they are. And I think we would probably all agree that there are pockets of opportunity, whether it's in, we've been talking about them for the last 2 days, whether they're in healthcare, early stage technology opportunities to service that rising millennial boom in China and across Asia and other places, whether it's the ageing population needing different types of services and infrastructure. In my view, what we need to do as investors is figure out how we can reposition our portfolios to take advantage of that and not be so beholden to this concept of economic growth that we've lived with for the last few decades.
So how do you view it, and how does it guide your investment?
Well, so we've been hearing about that again over the course of the conference, but for us, we've reduced our sort of broad risk in the portfolio to things like equity, beta, or bonds. So we hold no bonds in the portfolio per se. The equity exposure's come down quite a lot, and we've built cash for optionality. But at the same time, for example, our private equity portfolio has been refocused on growth opportunities. We're not really doing big buyout that requires growth, leverage, rising asset values for an exit, because we don't think that's a good bet in this market, certainly at current entry prices. But we're doing onshore Chinese private equity. We're doing a lot of growth private equity in Asia, in this part of the world. We have multiple mandates focused on that. we're doing early stage tech venture, but we're also doing hedge fund strategies which rely on skill and not necessarily market directionality.
And for an0drew, for Japan, it is about unlocking the savings. Do you see that happening? And how can it be done?
Well, we have a huge saving at the corporate level and individual level, and it's only the government who are borrowing. That's the very interesting. That's the characteristic of Japanese balance sheet, right? So it's very probably difficult to unlock the saving by individuals because it's associated more like a psychological aspect of the savers, but Japanese government took initiative, and the GPA also stepped up and working with our asset manager to tighten the governance on the Japanese corporation. And one of the very commonly discussed topic between asset manager and the corporations are the use of the cash, because the Japanese corporations they have as much cash as the big mega financial group on their balance sheet as a whole. So that saving can be more. I'm not saying I shouldn't say easy, but more realistically released. But when it comes to the release of the individual saving, it's going to be. I think it will be very difficult.
But can the delay in the tax help?
Well, the tax is a very interesting topic in Japan because every time the government trying to increase the consumption tax, it becomes such a big political deal, and it consumes a lot of political capital. The reason is only 15% of Japanese individuals ever filed tax return by themselves. So Japanese people are not very tax conscious. I said only the consumption tax rate they know. So they always have a very, very high resistance against the consumption tax hike. But if you ask the Japanese people in this room, I can guarantee probably very few of them know their effective income tax rate. So tax incentive doesn't necessarily work as clearly as it could work in the other countries. But so I'm not that optimistic about the releasing the individual saving. And at the moment, we haven't been able to create the positive cycle of, the stock market goes up, everybody wants to shift the money from the saving to the equity investment. That's not happening yet. So that's a tough question. But can I revisit the Asian growth thing a little bit? Don't get me wrong, I'm actually quite confident about the growth of Asia. But I think for the we should be prepared for what we experienced in Japan when I was a young banker. We used to say, when America sneezes, Japan got cold. And I think that's going to happen to the rest of Asia. When the China sneezes, everybody else gets the cold. So that's the situation for the short-term future. But mid-term, long-term future, I totally agree. The Southeast Asia has a lot of the positive demographics and all those attributes which should contribute to the future growth. But we have to be realistic that there's a supply chain which now has the China as an OEM, and who get the hit? The suppliers get the hit. So that's the reason I was being.
And that is a valid point, Jeffrey. When China sneezes, the rest of Asia catches a cold, and we have seen that a 2% devaluation of the yuan led to the stock markets slumping, and just a small drop in China's GDP, small drop in its growth, led to the commodity slump.
I think, if I may, it goes back to the point I tried to make earlier, which is that model of where you're expecting growth to come from China continuing to grow in the same way and pulling the same imports from the rest of Asia is gone, right? China's not going to grow at that speed in those industries again. But the question is, can other countries in Asia then look at its own internal growth possibilities and see ways in which it could change its economy around to grow without the Chinese bit?
So where are the bright spots?
So an example, I think, is India, right? So where we know that there is already a pretty large middle class, badly served currently by infrastructure that needs massive investments. That infrastructure investment, just like in China, in the early stages, has enormous economic benefits which are just waiting to be tapped. And what China was able to do was, during this period of its growth, was invest heavily in infrastructure, which actually led to other businesses being able to be opened up. I think India is taking some of those steps. So the removal of putting in a GST instead of at the state border type of taxes will free up interstate commerce in India, which opens up business opportunities, creates efficiencies. That allows companies to make better profits, reinvest, hire more. That's one. Certainly, infrastructure, if it's invested in properly, will likewise create opportunities to take products produced in one region to another region and to be sold and create new markets away. I would say, countries like India, Indonesia, where there are large domestic markets, there is a lot of self-help that can be done, and a lot of companies are ready to invest and ready to make sure that happens. And the government, I think, is supportive, at least in those two examples.
Mark, which markets do you see opportunities the fastest growing?
I mean, I think across the region, I think as the guys have said, and
If you have to name 3 markets.
China, Indonesia, and the Philippines, I think would be the 3. But I think to Jeffrey's, I wouldn't put India at the same level. I think the theory and the practice there, I think, is yet to be proven. Yes, GST has come through, and at the federal level, in spite of the fact there's no majority in the upper house that's been passed, now put it down to the state level, where the politics really gets challenging and interpreted, whether that will be done within a reasonable time frame. Infrastructure in India, we've been talking about it for a very long time. Actually going into execution, we haven't seen that. Whereas I think we've seen in the Philippines, you've seen in Indonesia, you've seen in China, the reality of that happening. I think it's not, to me, yet proven in India particularly, even though the potential is phenomenal. The potential's been phenomenal for a long time.
I think Mark, if I may, Mark raises a really good point. I mean, these are potentials, possibilities that still require to be executed well. And the one thing that's different is I will say that policy makers and politicians are more realistic about the fact that they need to execute it. If I think about China, is it a country where the leaders don't understand the problems of pivoting from an old economy to a new economy, or that they have debt problems? I think they do. It still means that the execution will require them to be very skilled, and the politics and everything else has to fall in place. But at least they know it. And I think that the difference if I think about Japan in the early 1990s was nobody knew that was the path that a declining demographic country starting at very high property and equity prices, that actually that's the path. Because I think if they knew that was the likely path, they would have done something. I think now with the benefit of hindsight of all the lessons learned from other countries, I think people know that these are some of the issues. So I think there's reason to be hopeful, but it is.
But China's transition, though, Rafael, could be a bit problematic, right?
Well,
transformation to a consumer-based economy will take time.
Give one other perspective before I talk about that. So today, where Australia, no country has benefited more from the recent investment boom in China than Australia. And no country should be hurting more right now than Australia. But the reality is the Australian economy is doing just fine. Why? Because it's already transitioning, firstly with a lower currency, but secondly with things like tourism, education, healthcare, agriculture, and those businesses still with China as much as anywhere else are doing great. But as an Australian investor, our direct exposure to Asia right now is just around 20% of the portfolio. It should be much more given the backdrop we've been talking about. So why isn't it? The answer is because there are many regulatory issues with investing into Asian countries. They're all different, but whether it's the rule of law, transparency, how the courts work, currency convertibility, freedom to go into and out of capital markets as you wish, most of the big economies in Asia make it difficult. And so if Asia wants to meet its potential that we've been just talking about, the policymakers need to start going down that path of opening up to the global capital pool of which there's a surplus.
And China?
Well, so I'm optimistic. I mean, I'm a bit of a China bull in a way, and as I said, we're already investing into private equity strategies in China.
The transition to a consumer.
Right, so it will not be smooth, and no transition could be.
Are you concerned?
Well,
with the
we're here for the long run, and so I don't worry too much about what's going to happen next year or even in 3 years. What do I know? I know that China is transitioning. I know that the policymakers understand that, they have a plan, they're focused on it, and they understand the risks. Will they make mistakes? Yes. But most countries have taken hundreds of years to make the transition they're trying to make. So I'm quite optimistic that ultimately it will emerge in much better shape with lower growth, as it must have, because it's a much bigger economy and it will be more inward generated growth. What does that mean? That means you have to have the right risk profile, not too much leverage, and you have to be prepared for a volatile ride.
Hiro, you don't like China, you don't particularly like Japan either. Is there anything you like?
No, I like Japanese food and Chinese food. I just don't like French. Well, I think the Japan actually despite all those negatives, including a demographic and etc., I think at the moment the stock market has been priced quite low by any scale or any measurement. So as far as the investment is concerned, actually I like Japan at the moment. When it comes to China, I tend to agree that we wanted to have more private equity investment because I'm bracing myself for a little bit bumpy ride. And the one thing I probably kind of disagree with what Jeff said is I'm perfectly sure Chinese leaders understand the problem, and I don't see any problem with their execution because they don't have a custom democracy. They can do it if they decide. But the problem is, this is a situation none of the developed countries ever being able to successfully and smoothly manage this transition. So I really cannot be confident that leader knows what to do. They know the problem, and once they have come up with a plan, they can execute it. So the one thing what we observed last year is they came up with very interesting, restriction on the Shanghai market, and they withdrew almost the day after. And that's a very good example of what I just described. They know the problem. They come up with a plan. They execute it. But it doesn't necessarily mean their plan is good. So I'm really, really, hopeful that the Chinese leader come up with a good plan and execute it. But I more realistically expect that they try a lot of different plans because there's no clear textbook to follow.
But is there one policy you would like the Chinese government to implement that it hasn't?
No, actually, I don't know. I mean, what's a good plan? This is a problem. I mean, I actually, if you study the history of all the developed economy, they always have a very painful transition from the manufacturing-based to a service consumer-based economy. And China is trying to do it. At that time, their average income is very low because in the history, most of the country transition happened a bit later stage in terms of the people's standard of living. So I'm concerned, but I'm also hopeful that there are a lot of positive attributes. So that's the reason I hope if we could make more like a private equity investment in China, it's probably safer because they can pick the company or the businesses more selectively. But when it comes to the public equity, given our size, we have to go through the passive, which is actually quite difficult for me to just feel safe overnight.
When you talk about the future of the Asia-Pac region, we have to talk about the fourth industrial revolution, because that's going to change a lot of things. We're already seeing driverless taxis in Singapore. Yes, Mike, I haven't tried it yet. How are you factoring that in? Will that be a disruption to jobs, or will we see more of a creation of jobs?
That's interesting.
I think a lot of the disruption is aimed at existing business models. So, if you're a VC fund trying to fund a tech company, it's very hard to fund something that has, well, I don't know what the size of the addressable market is because it's a new product, and I don't know whether it'll grow. But if you have a product that says, well, with technology, I can solve this problem better for this group of consumers that are currently paying somebody else this huge amount of money, they can see that the addressable market is 20 billion. I should fund this. So I think a lot of what we're seeing in the fourth industrial revolution is aimed squarely at improving the costs, undercutting the costs, if you will, of existing businesses. And that I think is, you asked about employment growth, that is very worrisome because many of the traditional industries will see employment disintermediated away. You've talked about driverless cars disintermediating taxi drivers, effectively making the demand for cars come down over time. All of these are job destroying. I think the next step that needs to take place is whether there are other models that are creating new markets where people will be employed and so on. In China, one of the examples is that now with everything accessible through your mobile phone, what they call O2O, so it's becoming a lot easier. You can now access services that in the past are available offline, which you didn't even know existed in the area. So things like that actually are counterbalancing, maybe creating some jobs, but clearly the pressure is coming from the disintermediation, the job destruction or substitution path.
Raphael, how do you?
I don't think Asian countries like China are any different to the rest of the world. When I can 3D print anything I want at home, I don't need to get it manufactured in China. But the people all around the world will have to respond to the changes we're going through. Maybe if some countries are less developed, actually the tension and the disruption will be less because there's less to disrupt and they can go straight to the new model, just like fixed telecommunications networks never got built in a lot of those countries because they went straight to mobile.
Hero?
I'm very optimistic about what the new technology will bring into our society and the economy. And when there's a new technology, there's always the new businesses which support or supplement. So we shouldn't really think only about the equation. The technology reduces the human hands to the help our living. And I'm a big believer of technology. That's probably the reason why I'm the only one Pokemon player, Pokemon Go player on this panel. But even a Pokemon Go increased the total fare or total income of bus operator, right? So the technology always brings some other income sources for the older businesses too. So I'm actually quite optimistic about that, that transition.
How are you bracing for the fourth industrial revolution?
I think it's interesting. I think just if we take just one element of the business, and I think related to some of the things Andrew said earlier, when you look at the change in genetics and genomics and the future and the disruption that is going to cause, when you think of the speed of development of the science people talk about as being 6 times the speed of Moore's law, the ability for the medical profession to understand it, the ability to actually commercialize it. You have alongside that clearly the sequencing of the whole genome, what that's going to do to the future of medicine. And ultimately at some point, and again this is 20, 30, 40, 50 years ahead, children that are born will be automatically sequenced, and basically a medical pathway for their life will be set. It's going to cause major elements of disruption. You're seeing in different elements of China massive investment in robotics at a level that is really unprecedented. That itself is going to cause major employment issues for a whole section of the economy and a whole section of the workforce. And again, understand the Chinese workforce, the average retirement age in China is 54 today. The average retirement age in Europe is the early 60s. The average retirement age in South Korea is 73. And I think to Hiro's point as well, looking at dependency ratios, the dependency ratio, i.e. people in work to people retired in a country that will support the generation of retirees. Today in China is 6-1, which it was in Japan 20 years ago. In Japan today it's 2-1, and unless something is done, China will move the same way. In 20 years' time, it will be 2-1. So massive investment in education.
It may be quicker because they have only one-child policy, so it could be quicker.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Massive investment in education, investment in the social security system.
What are you doing at AIA to meet the changing needs, to be part of this fourth industrial revolution? Are you doing anything differently, gearing towards that?
You keep on the edge. You keep on the edge of investing, and not the bleeding edge, but you keep on an edge of looking at the future. We have a number of partnerships with all sorts of universities and educational institutions. We have accelerator programs where we're sponsoring private equity companies that are not going to the market, to help them in terms of their healthcare and the development of new devices, etc. We have, again, major investment in artificial intelligence and where that's going to go into the future. All of these things are essential that we stay absolutely on the edge of this looking forward, because the technology and the rapid speed of development of technology is something that we need to pay enormous attention to.
Okay, before we open the discussion to the floor and take questions, I'd just like to ask each panelist what you view as the biggest risk for the region as we go forward. Rafael?
Well, I think right now, as an investor, it's got to be what happens to the path of interest rates. And if the US moves too quickly and drives the US dollar up, that's going to hurt a lot of...
The US is not going to move too quickly, I don't think.
Well, I don't think they will, but that's the whole thing about investing. If we had a crystal ball, we'd all retire. We'll see what happens.
I think if you will, the business environment or the political governance around the business environment is pretty important. I think we've seen too many examples as countries develop that becomes the sticking block for countries to be able to adjust quickly, adjust enough, or to allow businesses to adjust quickly. So I give an example of the UK. I mean, if you went to the UK in the late 70s, early 80s, all you'd hear was talk about deindustrialization and how, steel workers, coal miners, all the traditional industries, were going overseas, and there's nothing left. And it really took a change in governance and a change in business environment. And by the late 1990s, I'd say the UK really was and now still is considered one of the more dynamic economies in the world. 1980s, you never would have thought that of the UK. So that piece is very important, and whether countries can stay on that path and so on is very important. And I think for China that is also quite key.
Hiro?
I don't want to repeat that. I always find the China slowdown is the biggest risk. But as I mentioned earlier, I still believe in that the Asian region's economic growth. But to make it happen, other than China, these regions still need a foreign capital to invest into their infrastructure to make the growth really happen. And if the Chinese slowdown is actually more significant than people were kind of taken into account, and it scared the capital off from investing into the rest of the Asia, that would totally hinder the investment thesis. So I think the sources of China, as I repeat, but that the consequence will be most concerning to me.
And Hiro, earlier on you didn't say which markets you liked.
Okay.
With
Well,
Southeast Asia,
Well, I think that Southeast Asia is actually all have the other promising demographics, and some of the country you mentioned, obviously I liked it, but I think our fund is too big to name some countries. So. If I can avoid that question, as we agreed.
Mark.
I mean, I think the greatest risk is being too timid and too cautious. I think in the environment.
Has the region been too timid?
I think it has. But particularly going forward into an environment that is changing as rapidly technologically and otherwise as it is, I think to have the clarity, to have the courage in trying to continue to reinvent and think through where you're going to be in the future is fundamental, and that's going to need some hard decisions.
And on that note, let's open it to the floor. If there are questions, please state your name and who the question is directed to. Thank you. Could we have someone's on the way?
Thank you. My name is Doug Appel with Pensions and Investments newspaper. I wanted to ask Jeffrey, you're talking about this next model. Is what you're talking about, this domestic demand-oriented focus, does that make all the people on the panel less concerned about whether anybody is sneezing and much more focused on country-specific allocations?
Actually, if I could maybe start off, the country has already sneezed, and we've been hurting for 3, 4 years. So it's not a new. I think we're all having to adjust to that already. From an investment point of view, ourselves, like actually most on the panel, ultimately look at investments on an individual basis. Nobody allocates, really should be allocating just to a country or something, because a country's prospects ultimately can only be invested in if the underlying companies or the securities you're buying in particular have the right risk reward. And so long as some of that change, that pivot, that change in business model is occurring in some companies and they're taking advantage of it, then there are things for us to invest in. And I think from a stock-specific, investment-specific, there are a lot of things that are worth investing in. And for us, I mean, so long as some pivot is taking place, even the whole economy doesn't immediately pivot, that there are good things to invest in, even at the size that we are. In private equity, as has been mentioned by my fellow panelists a couple of times, it's actually quite difficult. There are some countries where it's next to impossible to get access to deals. It's the barriers to not only to language, business community, and so on. So in the public markets, actually, there's maybe a little less of that opportunity because a lot of those new business models are occurring privately. But that's the work that effectively we're paid to do, is to go look for them.
Yeah, I mean, economics doesn't stop at a border. Trade flows, at least these days, and let's hope it continues, and so you can have a view. But actually, tax laws, regulation, rule of law does. And so policymakers need to focus on those things and make sure they're making it as easy as possible for capital of any sort, wherever it comes from, to help them fund their growth, their needs, their transitions.
Anyone wants to add? No? Please?
Hello, my name is Michael Sterling with Sterling Infrastructure Partners. My question is, with regard to Brexit, have you reviewed your policies in allocating to the UK and Europe, or do you foresee a change in your allocations, or is it a non-event?
Would that be for everybody?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's go with Hiro.
Okay. Brexit is event that, obviously we allocated some risk weight to that result, but the market as a as a whole believed in that they were going to stay. So after that, we are not like a daily trading like a hedge fund or like a short-term investment fund. So we haven't really trying to trade in and out given that result, but I actually expecting that the negotiation are going to be really bumpy. So I just came back from London and spoke with a lot of like political leaders, but they think the negotiation is going to be very bumpy. So if we have to brace ourselves that we are going to see a lot of like positive and negative until the last minute. But I really don't think that should have like the immediate implication to the asset allocation.
I mean, maybe I'll be the quickest. I think we asset liability match locally. We have 18 markets in Asia. We have no exposure to the UK. Has no relevance whatsoever.
Really? I think voters in the UK knew what they were voting against, but not really what they were voting to go into. So I think that still remains to be negotiated over the next 2 or 3 years. So it's actually very hard to make a policy decision at this point. I think we will take a look at it, see what prices are available relative to where we think things will eventually pan out. But again, the positive thing is that I do think the UK is relatively business friendly, so UK companies will have to live with a new reality, and then they will readjust. So hopeful.
From a global growth point of view, it's irrelevant. Of course, if you live in the UK or you invest into specific assets, it can be extremely relevant. I think the most important thing, though, isn't anything to do with growth. It's actually understanding that here's a situation where there's an educated population that's been involved with Europe for decades, where I think 4 of the 5 major political parties said stay, where I think 300 of the FTSE 300 CEOs said stay, where all the people who would normally comment on these things said stay, and yet the population was so disaffected, so disenchanted with their lot that they voted to leave. And that is a flag waving, I think. It's a red light flashing. It's not just the UK. We'll see what happens in the US election. All over the world, certainly in developed economies where we've had this increasing wealth disparity with people who have really benefited from QE because they already owned assets that have been inflated, and we've had people where their industry has been hollowed out, where there's been no real wages growth. That is a meaningful issue and a huge risk to the global outlook, I think.
Any other questions? Curtis Chin, where are you? Now, since there are no other questions, let's wrap up the session. Glass half full or half empty for Asia Pac 15, 20 years down the road?
Half full. More than half full.
Hero?
I don't know that English expression very well, but
Half full, half empty? Whether you're optimistic?
it sounds the same to me.
In percentage terms. In percentage terms.
Yeah, 60, 70.
60, 70%? Not certain?
Can I dodge this question?
No, you've dodged one already.
30.
30? Okay.
Well, I think it's half full.
Half full?
I'm an optimist. I'd much rather be in Asia than Europe right now.
So pretty split. We did a vote earlier on before we started the session. Let's do a vote after. So how many of you here are optimistic about the Asia-Pac region? And I believe it's more than when we started. Ladies and gentlemen, please do enjoy the rest of your time in Singapore. Enjoy the F1 if you're staying here. Thank you very much. Gentlemen.